All right, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for coming, everyone. This is very cool. This is my, I think, third mass adoption meetup. I came to one last month, a little closer. Up, higher, right here. Can you hear me now? All right. It's just a little, because it's right in my ear, so I don't know how loud I am, but you can hear me in the back? Okay, great. This is my third mass adoption meetup. I think the first one I came to was like 2 years ago, the first Freedom Festival they put on. But anyway, I'm 23. I started in Bitcoin just to kind of begin where everybody was, and then I'll go into a little bit of where we are now, the global macro backdrop, a little bit of how that plays into Bitcoin, and then I'll talk about my company, which I'm a part of now. I got into Bitcoin in 2020 when I had been kicked out of my freshman year in college because of COVID. They kicked everybody out during spring break, which sucked because I left everything in the dorm because I was gone for spring break. I brought an overnight bag. I couldn't go back and get my computer, anything. They didn't let us go back and get anything. And so I became kind of jaded toward authority at that point, and rightfully so, I think. And so that summer, I had started a painting business in order to make some money. I walked away from that summer with about $25,000 to $30,000 in profit. I did probably $120,000, $130,000 in revenue that summer when I was 19. And I needed a vehicle to deploy it in. I was kind of leaning toward the wanting to work in financial markets side of things. They had given us free Bloomberg terminals in our library at school, and so I played around in those in my free time. That was basically my life. It was going to class, going to the library to play on the Bloomberg terminal, and then going to the gym, going to eat, and then going to bed. And I learned a little bit about Bitcoin, but I wasn't entirely interested in it until I had this big pile of money, at least a big pile of money for a 19-year-old. And my friend Tyler LaRoche, best buds, we were basically taking every class together. He now works at Bitcoin Inc., the company that puts on the Bitcoin conference and Bitcoin magazine and all of that. And he had told me about Bitcoin. This was in late 2020. It's like October 2020. Price was probably around 30,000 or something like that. And so he gave me two pieces of reading material: The Masters and Slaves of Money by Robert Breedlove and The Bullish Case for Bitcoin by Vijay Boyapati, which I assume a lot of you have read. And both of those kind of sent me down the rabbit hole, if you will, right? The Austrian economics rabbit hole, right? I began reading a lot of Milton Friedman. Obviously, Safety and a Moose, basically a great deal of books trying to immerse myself in this world. And then after a month or two, I decided to put most of what I had earned into Bitcoin, which was a fantastic choice because then the price proceeded to go all the way up to $64,000. And for a 20-year-old, I was in an extremely good position. So from that point on, I came into it for the freedom aspect of things, but also because number go up, right? As one of the reasons a lot of people get into Bitcoin. But I stayed for a very different reason. I stayed because Bitcoin is money, right? It's the most pristine form of money we've had. And I believe, and my colleague Nick Bhatia over at the Bitcoin Layer believe, that Bitcoin is the world's most pristine collateral, right? 24/7, 365, increasingly highly liquid. And we believe that it's going to exist at the base layer of global financial markets and the global financial system at large. And so that's what has kept me in Bitcoin and what got me involved. I did the painting business for another year, and then I decided to leave school 1 year early in order to build this markets research company with Nick Bhatia. And we've now amassed 25,000 Substack subscribers, about the same number of YouTube subscribers. And essentially, that's what I do. I stare at charts all day long. I look at my Bloomberg terminal. I take a look at rates, money markets, risk assets broadly, Bitcoin included, commodities. And I try to make sense of it all for readers and viewers of the show and readers of our Substack publication. And here we are now. And so I'll get into a little bit of the global macro backdrop. So obviously Bitcoin, as I speak to you, it's almost at 100K. I can't quite put this hat on yet because Bitcoin is not $100,000, but we're very close. And obviously, to back things up a little bit, that's a huge psychological milestone. People were talking about 100K before I was in the space. At $100,000, Bitcoin is almost a $2 trillion asset. Right now, it's roughly 10% of the size of gold. which is just insane. It's an insane thing to think about, and to think that we're still only 10% of the way to gold parity when Bitcoin as an asset performs gold's functions without a lot of the drawbacks that gold has. Gold's lack of portability, the fact that it is relatively scarce and not absolutely scarce, Bitcoin solves for all of those things. And so even though the price is almost at $100,000, obviously that'll be on news chyrons all around the world. We're still only 10% of the way there for the very low end of the total addressable market for Bitcoin. And so it's a very landmark moment. So I'm very happy to be speaking with you tonight about it, because at the end of the day, gold will be usurped at some stage by Bitcoin for that reason, right? It's an absolutely fixed supply. It has this disinflationary supply schedule that eventually will exhaust itself, whereas gold does not. Gold miners are becoming more efficient. As the gold price rises, more miners have the incentive to begin mining gold. New mines get opened up. Technology to get gold out of the ground and to find it become more efficient. And all of those are suppressants on the price, right? Its supply schedule is rising, and it will continue rising because we've only mined a fraction of the gold that we believe is on Earth. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's not the case, right? Everybody in this room knows this. Bitcoin has this absolutely fixed disinflationary supply schedule that, long after everybody in this room is probably gone, there will be no more, right? In around the year 2140. And the market is beginning to catch on to this, but they haven't quite caught on to it yet. If you just take a look at basic correlations, and I would love to be showing some charts to you as I do this, but I'll just go kind of off the cuff because I frankly like doing that without having to lean on the charts. If you look at cross-asset correlations, Bitcoin has always been very tightly correlated with the main risk assets you have, right? Equity indices, namely the Russell and the NASDAQ. And right now, Bitcoin's correlation with those indices is very close to 1. And so Bitcoin is still traded like it's this infinitely issuable tech stock when it's not, right? And so there's this huge informational arbitrage to be captured, right? Bitcoin is what will ultimately usurp gold because it serves gold's function better than it does, but it's being traded like the NASDAQ or like a penny stock or something like that. That's how it's treated by the market writ large, judging by the correlations that it has to equities and other risk assets, high yield credit, for example. And so we're 10% of the way to gold parity. By the time that the market comes around to this, I think we'll probably be closer to 50% gold parity or 75% gold parity when people really catch on to what Bitcoin actually should be traded like. And so everybody in this room right now is in Bitcoin at the stage of Bitcoin's monetization process before that informational arbitrage is no more, right? The market believes that in times of panic, you sell your Bitcoin, just like you sell the NASDAQ, just like you sell your Apple or Microsoft stock. But that's the moment when you should be purchasing Bitcoin. In the same way, that's the moment people purchase gold, right? And so everybody in this room right now is taking advantage of that informational arbitrage. You are still in the market when people believe that Bitcoin is a tech stock when it's not. But we're well on our way there, right? We're well on our way to closing that up. Bitcoin is now the 8th largest asset in the world. It passed Saudi Aramco. We're now about $100 billion more valuable than the world's biggest energy company. And we're about $250 billion rather less valuable than Google. So Google is next up. It is Google. Yeah, Google or Microsoft. If I had the chart up in front of me, I'd be able to say it, but I believe it's Google at $2.25 trillion. And so, going back to kind of the global macro picture that we're in now, that's kind of an overview of where Bitcoin is and where it stands psychologically in the market. The global macro backdrop couldn't be more favorable. By all accounts, it's the most favorable macro backdrop that Bitcoin has been the beneficiary of since 2020. Obviously, when governments shut down the world because of COVID, you had this huge panic. The Fed cut interest rates. They had an emergency meeting. They slashed their policy rates, including Fed funds, which is the main one that everybody in this room watches, to 0. And it kept it there for 2 years, a little bit over 2 years, until they started raising interest rates again. And during that time, Bitcoin obviously crashed from 10,000 and then it appreciated all the way up to 64,000. That was during a period where the world was in recession, right? We were in recession as a function of what those governments did, and then we slowly opened back up, and only now are we kind of in a position where the world is fully open again and the global macroeconomy is chugging along. Now we're in a kind of a different position. So Bitcoin loves when the Fed cuts interest rates, but there isn't a recession. The Fed has kind of two types of interest rate cuts, right? The cuts that we're experiencing now are normalization rate cuts. So the inflation rate is coming down. Prices are not coming down, obviously, because inflation is the rate of change of prices. So you have, politicians being disingenuous and saying that, oh, inflation is coming down, and they want the layman to believe that that means prices are coming down. Obviously, that's not the case. But either way, price inflation has come down from 9.1% at its peak to currently 2.4, 2.5%, which is still above the Fed's long-run target, but the Fed has been holding its policy rates at 5.5 for a very long time. For almost a year, we were on hold, or over a year rather, we were on hold. And basically in this environment where we're not in recession yet, but the Fed is cutting interest rates so that they're not much higher than the rate of price inflation, those are normalization cuts. And markets love those. There's no panic in the market right now. The environment we're in is very different from 2020, where the Fed was cutting interest rates in response to recession in a similar way that the Fed was cutting interest rates in 2007 and 2008 in response to recession. Asset prices reacted extremely negatively. Basically all correlation shot to one as everybody sold everything. Now it's a little bit different. So people are moving out on the risk curve. They're not selling their investable assets because we're not in a recession. So the Fed is lowering the cost of capital relative to price inflation, and we're not in a recession yet. And so as rates come down and U.S. Treasury yields lead/follow, the amount of money that you can get in your high yield savings account relative to putting it into the stock market shrinks. And as that spread shrinks, people move out on the risk curve. And I talked about Bitcoin being treated like a risk asset. During this time, Bitcoin's a beneficiary of that because the highest beta risk asset of them all, based on its size as well, is Bitcoin. And so as people move out on the risk curve into these assets that they can get a larger yield relative to the U.S. Treasury market, they're moving out, and they're moving out into Bitcoin largely. And that's very much helped by the fact that these ETFs are now online. Institutional investors who previously didn't have a way to access spot Bitcoin, they could access Bitcoin futures via the futures ETFs or directly through CME. They could not access spot Bitcoin exposure. And now we've seen that they can. And so that's very favorable, right? So I talked about the interest rate component. That's extremely favorable. The fact that we're not in recession, but rates are coming down. So people are still sticking with their investable assets, but they're moving out on the risk curve into things like Bitcoin, which are still considered highly risky. They're very high beta. You can capture a lot of upside if you invest in Bitcoin during a bull market. But the other component of it is that these ETFs are now around, and these are vehicles that were not here last cycle. So the spot Bitcoin ETFs launched on January 6th of this year. IBIT was the single most successful ETF launch in U.S. markets of all time. It took 111 days or 112 days for IBIT to reach $40 billion in assets under management. And for reference, the other ETFs, right, that it took that amount of time to reach, it took them well over a year. So I believe the next runner-up was something like 900 days or 1,200 days or something insane. And so by basically every account, particularly assets under management, IBIT, which is BlackRock's spot Bitcoin ETF, was the most successful ETF launch of all time. And so there's been this extreme amount of, that just shows you there's been this extreme amount of pent-up demand from institutional investors who've been wanting to get into this thing. They haven't been able to. Now that they can get price exposure to it, they're allocating like there's no tomorrow. And so these ETFs have opened up the floodgates for all of this institutional capital to come in and allocate to spot Bitcoin price exposure. Now, obviously, they're not buying Bitcoin. The ETF issuers are purchasing Bitcoin on behalf of their clients and charging a small management fee for it. But regardless, these players now have the ability to allocate to a vehicle held by an entity that's buying Bitcoin on their behalf. That's massive. If you take a look at the amount of Bitcoin that's issued daily, we all know that it's 450. given the current block reward. The amount of Bitcoin that was purchased by these ETFs yesterday, can anybody take a guess as to how much Bitcoin that was? Anyone can just shout out a number. 20 million? No, not quite. Oh, in Bitcoin terms.
50,000.
No, not 50,000.
$4 million.
2,000. That's the closest so far. So it was 10,000 Bitcoin purchased by these spot ETFs. 6,700, I believe, was purchased by IBIT. So that equates to in one day. Yeah. So that's almost $1 billion, right, at current Bitcoin prices in a single day. The total assets under management across all these ETFs, I have it on my terminal, but I don't have it in front of me. I think it's close to something like $70 billion, 70 or $80 billion, something like that. And so you now have these vehicles, this extreme demand that's coming from this one single entity that can't stop allocating to it. And because these ETFs are also available, looking away from the institutions for a second, how many of you in this room are financial advisors? Nobody? Okay, great. Financial advisors, right, are now getting contacted by all of their clients who are asking and inquiring about Bitcoin, right, this asset that's all over the news, and they want exposure to it. And so increasingly what we're seeing is financial advisors rotating client portfolios into these spot Bitcoin ETFs, right, namely BlackRock and our very own Fidelity here in Boston, right? Those are the two largest Bitcoin ETFs. And so you have now Bitcoin is also the beneficiary of all of these people who have financial advisors or who are contributing to their retirement accounts, right? Who want exposure to it. And so you have the passive flows from people who are contributing to their retirement accounts. You have people who have actively managed portfolios from financial advisors who are demanding exposure to it, and advisors are allocating anywhere from 1% to 5%. And you have institutions. And all of that totals up to, as of yesterday, 10,000 Bitcoin in a single day, almost almost $1 billion in inflows in a single day. And so that was not around in 2020. The last cycle was special because what happened during COVID, it kind of lit that, desire for sovereignty underneath a lot of people. It certainly did with myself. I didn't recognize it at the time, but what they did to me, by not letting me come back and get any of my stuff when they sent me home for spring break, that's kind of the reason why I'm talking to you right now. Had that not happened, I may have not been in Bitcoin. I may have gone and become an accountant or something like that. But because of what they did, and I know that I'm not unique in this, it drove me into Bitcoin, right? And it drove a whole lot of people into Bitcoin too. And so 2020 was special because those people came into the market. The Fed printed an unbelievable amount of money. Rates were slammed down to zero. They started creating facilities to buy treasuries, on-the-run treasuries, and off-the-run treasuries, both from the treasury that were being issued, more than they already do today, which they do at every auction, but also from banks as well. So they were capitalizing the banks with freshly printed money by taking treasuries off their hands, and they were actively buying U.S. treasuries more than they already do today from auctions. And that sent Bitcoin to $64,000. This cycle is different because now everybody who was on the sidelines that was viewing that but had a few $100,000 in their retirement account, or these institutions that have several $1 million, tens of millions of dollars sitting there, they weren't able to access Bitcoin. They've seen it for the last 4 years. Now they're online. Now they're allocating to it. And the last component that kind of makes this the most favorable macro backdrop for Bitcoin since 2020 is obviously the incumbent president and his administration, right? We've never seen a world leader this size talking about allocating to crypto, quote unquote, specifically Bitcoin, right? Obviously, we had Nayib Bukele, who announced at Bitcoin 2021 conference in July of that year in Miami via a live stream that he would begin allocating to Bitcoin for his country's balance sheet. He was the first, right? Now, most people believed, right, that basically, I mean, if you just think about this logically, you would think that, okay, this tiny nation in Central America begins allocating to Bitcoin. You'll probably see kind of like a stair step of other small nations allocate to Bitcoin before you see, let's say smaller countries in Europe begin talking about it, and then eventually, maybe one day down the line, the United States. Only 3 years later, at the Bitcoin 2024 conference. Literally 3 years after Nayib Bukele announced this, you now have Donald Trump, who was favored in the polls at the time and is now elected to be the 47th president of the United States, talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve, wherein, and this is per Senator Lummis's Bitcoin Act of 2024, and I actually was the first person that got to interview her after she put this bill forward. She sent it to Nick and I 2 days before we got to read it. It was insane. And then we interviewed her, and that's live on the Bitcoin Layer on YouTube if you want to check it out. It was the only ever video I've done where I was wearing a suit, and it will probably be the last video that I ever do wearing a suit. But either way, her plan outlines that the United States would purchase 1 million Bitcoin, right, over a 5-year span. That's, a little bit less than 5% of the Bitcoin supply. And then all Bitcoin purchased would be held for a minimum of 20 years. So when these allotments of Bitcoin were purchased, that allotment would have to be held for 20 years. And then an independent committee would determine whether or not they would continue holding it or sell it off incrementally. That's insane. And so we went from 3 years ago, this tiny Central American nation riddled with crime, one of the last places that anybody would want to visit, allocating to Bitcoin, to the leader of the world, right, in terms of GDP, in terms of military might, talking about not just holding onto the Bitcoin we currently have, which is about $250,000. Most of that is, basically all of that is actually seized from criminal operations, Silk Road and the like. Not just holding on to what we have and not selling it like Germany did this summer, but actively allocating to Bitcoin, right? And so what that will ignite, inevitably, is other nations following suit and attempting to do the same, right? You can bet your bottom dollar that geopolitical strategists around the world are now meeting with one another to discuss the potential of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, or whatever they call it, some kind of sovereign national, treasury Bitcoin allocation, an active allocation strategy to front run the United States, or at the very least, try to keep up with them during this game. And you have states now as well that are openly discussing this. Pennsylvania, obviously in Wyoming, Senator Lummis's home state, they're discussing this. A bill was just put forth in Pennsylvania to do this very thing, to begin allocating to Bitcoin at the state level. And so you have these three factors, right? The Fed cutting interest rates into a non-recessionary environment, institutional capital and passive flows now being able to allocate to spot Bitcoin, and the world's leader, right? The world's biggest balance sheet, the world's biggest and best money printer, the country that is the that issues sovereign bonds that are at the base layer of basically all global money markets and capital markets. It's the world's biggest collateral market. It's $27 trillion in size, I think. I haven't checked in a couple of days the size of the U.S. Treasury market. Everybody wants our bonds, and we're talking about purchasing Bitcoin, right? So those are the three factors that make this the most favorable macro backdrop for Bitcoin since 2020. And I guess the thing that I'll leave you with, at least for the macro portion of this discussion and the Bitcoin portion of this discussion, is that I don't give out price targets. I don't do price targets or anything like that. But what I will say is that the structural demand that is online for Bitcoin now is at least 3 or 4 orders of magnitude larger than where we were last cycle. And you pair that with the fact that our deficit is currently, I believe, $1.5 or $1.6 trillion annually, and our deficit as a percentage of GDP is 7%, which means that our debt issuance is becoming increasingly less effective. Debt issuance needs to accelerate in order to maintain our targeted 2% quarter-over-quarter GDP growth. And it's really, the sky's the limit for Bitcoin in terms of its price potential. This cycle, I have absolutely no idea. Right now, Bitcoin has basically been following the global money supply, global M2 money stock to a T. But really, who knows? It's following the global M2 money stock with kind of like a 70-day lag. And that's actually moving down now. And so Bitcoin could see a bit of a correction after we move above 100K. But I'm not into technical analysis. I'm not into all of that gobbledygook. I like to zoom out and look at things from a very macro perspective. And the direction we're headed over the next 4 years, over the next decade, is Bitcoin goes much, much, much higher than this. I think $250,000 per Bitcoin this cycle is not something that's unreasonable to think about. If you just take a look at past cycle performance, And then you factor in the fact that Bitcoin is now a almost $2 trillion asset, so you're not going to get the same percentage returns. Somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000 per Bitcoin is perfectly reasonable. But again, I don't normally do that. I encourage everybody, the viewers of my show on Twitter and on YouTube, and the people who read my Substack or my articles that I've been publishing over at Theya Research, I encourage everybody to think from a macro perspective, but those are the three, and not get too focused on the day-to-day price action, just dollar cost average, and understand where this asset is invariably headed. But those are the three factors that make this the most favorable macro backdrop for Bitcoin since 2020. So with that, I will close out the, I'll close out the macro portion of this and see if there's any questions.
Yes. With respect to the strategic Bitcoin reserve, just thinking about it operationally, if I were working in the U.S. government, I wouldn't want to telegraph to the world that I plan on buying 1 million Bitcoin, because then the world would front run that trade. So it makes like all of us, if we heard that there would be a strategic Bitcoin reserve, we log into Fidelity and move everything into FBTC or MicroStrategy. And that would drive the price up enormously. So it's just, it doesn't sit well with me. Another thing, just ideologically, the government doesn't do well holding valuable assets, and I don't know if we want them sitting on lots of Bitcoin, just like they sat on lots of gold, and then they captured the gold market. So I get it, it pumps our bags, it's awesome, but I'm sort of ambivalent about the strategic Bitcoin reserve. And does that make sense to you? Why would the U.S. go to in Congress vote on a strategic Bitcoin reserve? They'd have to do it either, in the background, in the shadows, using the exchange stabilization fund, the plunge protection team, some kind of back channel. Maybe MicroStrategy is that back channel. Who the hell knows? But it just doesn't make sense that it would just, we get a bill, they vote on the bill, and then all of a sudden they start accumulating.
Right. It doesn't make sense, and it feels like we're living in kind of a bit of a fever dream right now. I want somebody to pitch me and wake me up. But a lot of the price action we're seeing right now is kind of a little bit of that front running, at least from the retail perspective, and probably some institutions as well. And that's why in the lead up to the election, if you mapped out, and I actually did this on Twitter, in the terminal, they added polymarket odds to the terminal. And so what I did was I just put Trump and Kamala's polymarket odds. I overlaid it with Bitcoin's price. Trump's odds followed Bitcoin with, basically like a 0.8 correlation. And so people were obviously very looking forward to Trump getting elected, probably because of the prospect of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And that's one of the many reasons we consolidated at previous all-time highs for 8 months. And now, now that Trump is getting elected, now that kind of nervousness about the prospect of the election is behind us, that's why right after the election, you've now seen a great deal of this price action. So the market is certainly enthusiastic about it. Will this actually happen? We know that the government historically does not care about managing the debt, balancing its budget. Those things are extremely unpopular. If they were popular, Ron Paul would have been elected in 2008. So I don't know if this thing really has a high likelihood of passing. We have a Republican majority now in Congress, in both the House and the Senate. If every single GOP member voted in favor of this, it would get passed. But we don't know if every single GOP member is going to vote in favor of it. We know there's some pro-Bitcoin Democrats, but largely this is a GOP thing. And we don't know if everybody is going to toe Donald Trump's line. We have seen what happens when you're a GOP member and you don't toe Donald Trump's line, like over the last 8 years. Most of the old guard has now been rotated out. In their place is a lot of new, fresh faces that will, vote in favor of this because it's something that Trump puts forward, or Trump is saying that he wants to establish, and he will have people in Congress put forward. And so, for me, it's kind of like a 70-30, whether or not this thing actually happens. The reason behind the bill itself, the reason that Senator Lummis put forward, was to manage the now $36 trillion in debt. By the way, we hit $36 trillion in debt the other day. Happy debt milestone for those who celebrate. It was put forward for that reason, to buy and then hold this Bitcoin, which is the most important component of it, for a minimum of 20 years in order to hopefully help manage the debt burden. And if you watch my interview with Senator Lummis, she kind of goes into a little bit more of the details behind the math on that. But again, we've never been good, particularly Congress has never been good about voting on resolutions to bring down our debt in any way. And so it remains to be seen if this thing gets passed or not. Not just because Bitcoin is still a very dangerous asset in the eyes of a lot of the people who are in Washington, but also because we've never been very good on voting on resolutions to help manage our debt. And so for me, I don't know if it is a very high likelihood of getting passed. I'm optimistic. Then again, I didn't think that the man who ended up getting elected, would, or at least at the very least, the incumbent president would be proposing a strategic Bitcoin reserve as part of his platform when he was aiming to get elected. So anything can happen. We should all view this very skeptically. I mean, as somebody who holds Bitcoin, we have a very high degree of skepticism as to whether or not this will happen. You also have to think about the security implications. If the U.S. government ends up owning a little bit under 5% of the terminal Bitcoin supply, what does that mean? There are many considerations, and this thing might not even get passed, but my biggest hurdle to get over, my mental hurdle, is the exact same as yours. DC doesn't want to manage the debt. Our debt load is accelerating. We can't bring it down through austerity because of the point about the deficit as a percentage of GDP, as I mentioned earlier. The only reason our GDP is still 2% quarter over quarter, 2.5%, they're getting revised higher and higher. The Atlanta Fed is revising them higher and higher. We really are in an economic expansion, even though it doesn't feel like it, at least by GDP, measuring by GDP. The only reason that that's happening is because we're spending so much debt into the private sector, we're spending so much money into the private sector via our accelerating debt issuance. And so I don't think managing the debt is a conversation that many people are willing to have in Washington. I think the problem needs to get a lot worse before something like this would get passed. The problem is already terrible. It's a bit of a ramble, but that's more of my thoughts on the strategic Bitcoin reserve. Wait, who had their hand up first?
My question is, I definitely like the thought of Bitcoin being a mirror of kind of global liquidity, and the Ronaldo Roman kind of take on everything. My question is, it seems like nothing stops this trade, right? With the debt deficit's been basically saying we're currently doing that in a good economy. What happens with some sort of crisis event that pushes the economy into a recessionary event? What do you think is the kind of global macro play and U.S. play? How do they sustain this through any kind of event that would kick things towards a recession? And then how do you think the macro environment will respond? And given how, after that, I feel like we all know how Bitcoin would respond, but how do you think the macroeconomic?
Yeah.
Because we're doing this during
Yeah, so asset prices are going to rise forever. And, it's because price inflation will always be something that the Fed targets as long as the Fed is an institution, which is a horrifying concept in and of itself. And it's a lot of reason why people got into Bitcoin. And so the solution to all of these crises when they happen is the exact same. They pump more money into the system in one way or another. In 2008, it was quantitative easing. In 2020, again, it was these purchases from banks of marketable securities, of treasuries and other things in order to basically make it so that banks didn't stop lending, because we live in a credit-based global economy. And so if banks stop lending, the world basically screeches to a halt. But cycle after cycle, the Fed, and so we know how they resolve these things, but cycle after cycle, the Fed has gotten better at making it so that the response is immediate and the size of the response is theoretically infinite. So with the Bank Term Funding Program, for example, in March of 2023, when Silicon Valley collapsed and the Fed called an emergency meeting and they created the Bank Term Funding Program overnight, that was an immediate response. Like, it was overnight when SVB collapsed. And it basically said that you can take your distressed U.S. Treasuries to us and we will value them at par, and you can go out and keep lending. And so that basically made it so the banks weren't scared to lend anymore. And that was an immediate overnight response that basically gave banks a blank check. The Fed had been raising rates at that point for a little bit less than a year. And it basically meant that all of the, all of the value that was eroded on the U.S. Treasuries that these banks owned as a result of the Fed's rate hikes could now be erased overnight. And so we know that the Fed can respond immediately, overnight, in whatever size they need to manage these crises, because they're not a business, right? They can generate money out of thin air, and they can do these asset purchase programs however large they need to be in perpetuity overnight. And so we'll just see more of the same, more of those kind of responses, if and definitely when we see some kind of black swan event, some kind of deflationary shock that spooks markets and spooks banks. And whether it's in housing like it was in 2008, whether it is a virus that came from overseas like it was in 2020, whether it's banks not being well enough capitalized and not managing their duration risk well enough like it was in 2023, something's going to happen that's going to cause a massive global panic. And I don't know what the solution will be, but it will come from the Fed. It'll be overnight, and it will be in whatever size is needed to manage it, which means more debt gets issued, more money gets printed into existence, and asset prices go up even faster. And so because the Fed is targeting 2% inflation, it is, we are printing all of this money. We are targeting 2% inflation. Asset prices will rise forever. But in these crisis events, it gives the U.S. government a reason to crank up the fiscal response, to issue more treasuries at an accelerating rate, and then asset prices go up even faster. And so that's the response function. It's always been the response function from the Fed and the Treasury. And it just means that during those periods, there's going to be some truncated period of panic, however long, however short it ends up being, rather, followed by a rapid ascent in asset prices. And that's just from being, a student of history, or even a student of just the last three big deflationary events we've had in 2008, 2020, and 2023. That's what's going to happen.
I just fell down, grasping that over the last 6 months. It's not, it's just a matter of pacing that, assets just melt up, right?
Yeah.
If they're melting up in a good time, just melt up faster than a bad time.
Mm-hmm.
And, the system never really breaks. It's just the pacing at which those who have assets get to climb above those who work for fiat.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So I want you to maybe correct my thinking, because I can't see why the Fed wouldn't buy Bitcoin soon. I mean, it just seems like if, with the example of something like MicroStrategy and El Salvador, all these places that are proving themselves that so successful, you're going to see so many more states going into it, and it seems like there's just no risk. And once one or two states go into it, I can't imagine the federal government wouldn't be jealous of that success. And if you have access to the printer, there's no risk there. So it seems inevitable to me, honestly. And I don't know what I'm missing, because I think it seems like, again, with this, and maybe the success isn't going to last, but it seems like
Wouldn't that hurt
businesses.
the U.S. dollar, maybe the confidence in the dollar, if the government started buying Bitcoin?
Back the dollar, buy Bitcoin.
So there are two parts there. To your piece, austerity isn't an option. At the federal level, we can't issue less debt. That's just not an option. Where our deficit is right now and how reliant our economic growth is on this perpetual and widening deficit, we can't suddenly say we're going to be austere, we're going to cut back here, here, and here. That's going to have an immediate impact on GDP, and it'll plunge us into a recession. And so you can't solve the debt problem through austerity. You have to solve it by having an asset like Bitcoin on your balance sheet appreciate faster than you can issue more debt, right? And so it's a no-brainer, frankly, for the United States to allocate to Bitcoin. It's just a matter of whether or not the people in DC actually understand it and understand that we can't be austere. They have no interest in being austere. None of these people can be fired from their positions. Obviously, they can be elected out, but there are no implications because the U.S. government isn't a business. They don't rely on being profitable. And so they've gotten away with just letting this debt problem run away for so long. It would be a way to correct this problem. And so, like, from a business owner's perspective, it's a total no-brainer to solve this debt problem by buying Bitcoin. But because the incentives don't align, because the government isn't a business, I don't know if they'll do it. I think what will drive them to do it is game theory. So if other nations are doing this, then the United States will, in all likelihood, follow suit. It seems like the United States is in a very good spot to begin accumulating Bitcoin before other countries do it. And it will bolster the U.S. dollar. It will bolster the U.S. dollar's position on the world stage because that's all the government cares about, right? The government cares that we're the global leader. The reason we're the global leader is not because of our military might or our economic might. It's because the U.S. dollar is the preferred currency for global payments. U.S. treasuries are the rails atop which global commerce run. And so it's in the United States' best interest to allocate to Bitcoin if other countries are doing it, other major countries are doing it, even though it would, in theory, fix a lot of our debt burden without us having to be austere. I don't think that's the reason they would do it. I think what will force the U.S. government's hand is when you hear talks of Russia or China or one of these other major global superpowers begin allocating to Bitcoin actively. I think that's when the ears of the people in D.C. will perk up and they'll finally listen. That's kind of where my head's at now that you asked that question.
Just a follow-up, because you might know the numbers, but I'm just curious, with all the money that, say, we sent to Ukraine, and have that money shifted to Bitcoin, like, how much does that buy? Is that a considerable amount or no?
How much money? I don't know how much money we've given to Ukraine.
So austerity, you're right, is not going to solve our problems. If you took money from one place that we completely waste, directly to Bitcoin, that seems like that, given how much we waste, could buy a lot. Yeah.
Does anybody know how much money we've given?
$64 billion.
64 billion? Okay. So yeah, no, that would be right then and there. That's it's a drop in the bucket for a $36 trillion debt, but arguably it'd be a better use of our money, especially now, rather than participating in endless overseas wars that we have very little interest in. Allocating to Bitcoin, yeah, there's a lot of waste that we can cut. It's this administration is kind of an aside, but it's kind of remarkable that this administration, one of the things they ran on was at least trying to manage the debt problem or trying to manage the overabundance problem with our spending, the Department of Government Efficiency. I'm amazed that that's something that was part of the platform and is now something that's going to be formalized. So it does seem that's the way that this administration's headed. Certainly there is a lot of ways to cut, and I think probably the first and biggest one, particularly now with Trump back in office and global leaders not wanting to mess with him. We saw in 2016 that really nobody wanted to enter into a hot war with him as the president. I think that ending wars will be one of the first ways in which we cut waste. Yeah, if we put that money to Bitcoin, it'd be a much better use of our capital. It would be a drop in the bucket in terms of our $36 trillion debt, because what did you say, 70 billion? 64? Okay, yeah, so it'd be a drop in the bucket in terms of that. But yeah, a lot of waste to cut and a lot of Bitcoin to buy. Right. I don't think so, because it would just be another asset that we hold at the government level. We used to hold gold. We used to have a lot of it. The dollar used to be backed by it. But what the U.S. government is proposing, specifically what the Bitcoin Act of 2024 is proposing, is not that we back the dollar with Bitcoin. It's that we add Bitcoin to our balance sheet in order to help manage our debt load. And so we wouldn't be able to, like, it wouldn't be tying the dollar to Bitcoin. So that way, like, the U.S. wouldn't be able to print infinite money. We'd still very well be able to do that. We'd be able to issue treasuries just like we are now. Every country would gobble them up because they need them as collateral. Every business within that country would gobble them up because they need them as collateral. And so I don't think that's a concern, because we wouldn't be tying the dollar to Bitcoin. We'd still have the ability to issue debt as much as we want, just like we are now, and we'd still have the ability to print as much money as we want.
Okay, so you don't foresee the U.S. ever making Bitcoin a national currency?
I don't think so, no. Because the dollar is why we're the global superpower. We kind of lucked out during Bretton Woods, which I want to go vacation there next year. Hopefully Bitcoin rises to a point where I could afford to have a stay in the George Washington Hotel. I think it's the George Washington Hotel, that's what it's called. Mount Washington, rather, excuse me, George Washington. But we kind of lucked out with Bretton Woods, because a lot of basically all of the world's economy as it exists today was built after World War II. And post-World War II, we got the luck of the draw, and we became the currency that underlied all of that. The global economy, like the foundation underneath this 100, 200-story skyscraper, 1,000-story skyscraper, is the US dollar. And so that's our superpower, right? The fact that we're underneath all of that. And so people need us for that. They need dollars, they need treasuries. So that's our superpower. It's not our military might. It's not our, our economic strength. Our economic strength is enabled by the fact that U.S. treasuries are the base layer of the global economy. So for that reason, I don't foresee the U.S. giving that up. So I don't think that there's a future where they make Bitcoin the global currency, or the currency of the United States.
You said that you foresee Bitcoin becoming the base layer of the financial system of the world.
Yes, but not by any one government. Yeah. So just like U.S. treasuries exist today, Bitcoin in and of itself is a much more pristine collateral. It can be called in at any time, and it's 24/7, 365. And there's no clearing entity in theory that needs to exist. And so for that reason, I believe it's a better collateral than U.S. treasuries. But I don't think that, because it's not any one government that's issuing it. And so I do think that Bitcoin will be the preferred collateral of the global financial system 50, 60, 70 years from now, when I'm old and gray and hopefully have 7 or 8 kids and 50 little grandkids. That's the hope. But so 2 different things there. Yeah.
First of all, I gotta say, 23 years old, dude, that is hugely impressive. You're running businesses.
Thank you.
You're doing all this. It's extremely impressive. When I was 23, I think I was playing video games, drinking beer, trying to impress girls with my kid stands. Which, by the way, does not impress any girls.
Thank you very much.
But what I was wondering was, do we have any insight at all into who is actually buying into the ETFs? Like the composition of the investors? Because, I mean, you mentioned some pretty impressive growth sets, and it's cool and all. I think some of it can be explained with people switching from GBTC into IBIT. So if you look at the net, it's a little bit different. But do we know anything about the composition of those investors into the ETFs right now?
So it looks like, what's that?
I have a comment on this.
Yeah.
So I have my securities license. I work for an investment firm. And up until this summer, we were not allowed to buy Bitcoin for ourselves or for any of our clients. And with the approval of the ETFs, they're now out there. And firms like Morgan Stanley, as of the last month or 2, are not only allowed to sell the ETFs to their clients, they're allowed to recommend them. So you think about the institutional markets and all the retail money that's in pension funds, those markets are now trickling into this.
Do we know?
Just personally, so my biggest asset, the biggest asset of most folks are their house or their 401k or their IRAs.
Yep.
My 401k plan has a brokerage account. My brokerage account has the ability, and it has Charles Schwab. I can now buy the ETFs with my 401k money.
Yeah.
And I've done it. I've got the Fidelity ETF. I've got a few of the BTC ETF in my qualified plan at my company.
Yeah, but you're a retail investor. You're not a pension
No,
fund
this is
or a
retail. This
sovereign.
is supposed to be. I'm a retail investor, but I'm doing it with my.
You're doing it through
institutional
background. Yeah.
Yeah. So he answered your question. So now, not only can these investment houses recommend it to their clients, but they could also buy it for themselves. And that was around last. So those are the two big cohorts that are participating in these ETFs: the investment houses themselves and retail investors. That's where you're seeing this demand come from for the ETFs.
I don't think most people understand the scope of how much money is out there and how small Bitcoin is. The value of the assets out there compared to where Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is still what, $3-4 trillion asset? $2 trillion?
1.96.
$2 trillion asset. And I mean, if you look at the global bond market, the stock market, the real estate market, we're talking hundreds of trillions. So we're nowhere, we're nothing.
Saylor says 900 trillion.
What's that?
900 trillion he thinks is the global wealth.
Yeah, how much of that just through this phenomenon we're in is kind of getting misallocated for like a store value outside the dollar?
Yeah.
How many people are those instead of maintaining a second or third home, they just like cost for number?
Yeah. Well, like he just said, that homes, 401ks, those are the two biggest assets that people own. I know the home I'm living in now, still living at the parents' house, 23, stacking Bitcoin, almost done paying my student loans, which I'm very mad at myself for taking out. I could have stacked like $100,000 in Bitcoin for what I ended up paying for school, which I left early and then didn't even use my degree to get a job with. I just got my job because of what I was tweeting on Twitter. Regardless, the home I'm living in now is like $1.3 million. It's not a home that's worth $1.3 million, right? When it was purchased by my parents in like 2004, it was a $400,000 home, right? And so homes are holding a lot of monetary premium that should not be in houses right now. And so Bitcoin stands to absorb a great deal of that monetary premium as fewer people use homes as investment vehicles, right? Rental properties that have to be managed, or second and third homes. A lot of that monetary premium that's currently in homes will be absorbed by Bitcoin. People will begin to think of homes less as an investable asset and more of as a place where you live, which is what they should be. Obviously, homes people will always have rental properties. People will always have second or third homes, vacation homes, what have you. But rather than holding those as investable assets, as people allocate to Bitcoin instead, over time you'll see Bitcoin absorb a lot of that monetary premium. And one of my friends over at Unchained, he worked as the VP of marketing, but today, Joe Burnett, he just got promoted to the Director of Market Intelligence. One of his theses is that this very thing will happen, that monetary premium that's currently tied up in homes will eventually make its way into Bitcoin. There's a lot of misallocated capital out there, not just in homes, but in a great deal of other things too. And over time, kind of multi-decade time horizon, Bitcoin will absorb all of that misallocated capital. That monetary premium will actually go to Bitcoin, which is money.
Are you advising to sell all real estate?
No, I'm not advising that you. I'm not financial advice at all. Don't sell.
I've got some anecdotes that went through that to be like where I've got my parents who own a couple homes and they just Airbnb and and my in-laws again own a couple homes in the Airbnb.
Must be nice to be a homeowner.
Yeah, they're all talking about getting rid of it because they're like, oh man, like the management costs need to get so high.
Yeah.
What do I do? And they were approaching me to be like, you think I should put it into Bitcoin?
There you go. You should charge a consulting fee for that. That's what you should do.
Like, and then my brother's folks are all having the same conversation. Like, there's actively people in the age group of like 60 to 70 that are thinking of like liquidating homes to put into something else. And they're all like, everyone that I know is talking about Bitcoin for the first time I've heard.
There you go.
So it's like,
1031.
yeah, it's like they're starting to kind of at least talk about it.
Yeah. Well, there you go. And anecdotal evidence there, but it's also real evidence too, because the huge Airbnb bubble down in Florida popped like a year and a half ago. If you look at, for example, I was looking in like Kissimmee, 5-bed, 4-bath house, $600,000, $700,000. That's insane. If you wanted to find a 5-bed, 4-bath house in Massachusetts that looked relatively new, you're looking at like a $2 million home, right? $2.5 million home. And so in markets where there was a huge Airbnb presence because of Disney World close by and the other theme parks close by, when the tourism market cratered over 2020 and then 2021, then you saw a lot of those Airbnb people throw their homes in the market. Now there's this huge supply glut in places like Kissimmee. And based on what you said in the New England area, with the outperformance of Bitcoin and people realizing that owning an Airbnb, owning rental properties, that's a job, you know. Airbnb can't necessarily be a side hustle. It has to be a full-time job. It can't just be an asset that you own. People are saying, okay, well, this is like active management. This is a second job. I want to allocate into something that I don't have to do any work. It does the work for me. Yeah, people are looking at Bitcoin for that.
Which is why you don't want your money to have value outside of a monetary value, right? Yeah, I mean, we're using our homes as money and as a savings vehicle, and that prices out people who are younger and the younger generations, and they can no longer afford it. So that's what, like, Peter Schiff's argument is, well, there's nothing tangible there. It doesn't have any use outside of just being money. I can't make cufflinks or jewelry out of it. It's a nonsensical argument. You don't want your money to have non-monetary use.
Right,
Because
right.
it causes a friction between use value and money.
Yeah, good point. You want money to be money. The world doesn't demand U.S. Treasuries and U.S. dollars because they could take their, certificate for their Treasury bond that they purchased and throw it in the fire, and it burns really well, and they could have they could use it for their fire in their fireplace. People don't demand dollars because it has another use case other than being money, and so over time, people will come to realize people will snap back to reality in that you want your money to be money and nothing else. And saying that Bitcoin has no value because you can't use it for anything is silly, because ask about dollars and why people use dollars even though it doesn't have any value outside of being money, then the Peter Schiff argument falls apart. So you're right. And it would be very nice if home prices would come down. Certainly, I'm looking at buying or putting a down payment down on a home, hopefully in the next couple of years. And Massachusetts is looking increasingly unlikely as the place that I'll be doing that. But I certainly hope to stay close to home. But younger people my age, like home buying is a distant dream. Anthony Pompliano posted a chart by age group, the amount of money that each age group would need to earn every single year in order to consider themselves financially successful. For boomers, it was like $70,000 a year. For Gen Xers, it was a little higher. For millennials, I think it's $180,000. For Gen Z, for my generation, it's like $500,000. And that's a little bit sensational, but the reality is these things that my grandparents certainly took a little bit for granted, like owning a home when they were young, people my age see that as a distant memory. So it would be very nice if that process of the monetary premium exiting homes and going into Bitcoin could happen a little sooner than later. Otherwise, I'll be a renter, and then I don't have to put a mortgage payment in, and I could just use that to buy Bitcoin.
Maybe one follow-up on the funds flow, but this time from a different perspective. As far as I understand, I think the BlackRock ETF, IBIT, they use Coinbase to actually procure the Bitcoin. I'm just curious, if these scenarios play out, I don't think there's enough mining Bitcoin out there to actually fill up the coffins of Coinbase to actually get enough Bitcoin. How are these OTC that's actually setting up the Bitcoin in the back of these ETFs, how are you procuring that Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, the same way that any OTC desk does, right? There's people who are selling it. And so that's one of the reasons why you see price doing what it's doing right now, because there's such overwhelming demand for it. And also with these, like, it sounds like this is a question of, like, are the ETFs buying real Bitcoin or are they buying paper Bitcoin?
No, I'm sure they're buying real Bitcoin, but I'm just
Right.
wondering, you're always hearing that, like, the exchanges are running out. You heard that a lot in 2022, and it didn't really happen. But do you think that's a potential reality?
No. I think
Every time you step up in price, there's always sellers.
exactly. I mean, for like us in this room, we are obviously Bitcoin in and of itself. You're already in like the 1%, less than 1% of the global population who even cares about this thing. The people in this room who came to a Bitcoin meetup, we are in the 0.0001% of people who are going to be holding this for years and probably decades to come. So most people think of Bitcoin as like a short ride. Right? They get in at 100, they get out at 120. I made a quick 20% gain. That's fantastic. That's how most people think of Bitcoin currently. So there will always be sellers, right, at every single level, just like you said. And so that's how these exchanges are getting this Bitcoin in order to sell, this Bitcoin that they hold in order for these ETFs to come and scoop up on behalf of their clients. So, until more of the world, or as more of the world thinks like us, then it'll be harder to procure that Bitcoin to meet that demand, and the price will move higher. And so as short-term holders, right, people who hold Bitcoin for 155 days or less, those are the entrants you start to see in a bull market, right? And this is observable on chain. When coins were moved less than 155 days ago, that's considered a short-term holder, somebody who's new to the market. You see those entrants begin to flood in during a bull market. That's the type of investor we're talking about here, where they buy Bitcoin as a short ride. As more and more of the market, as each bull market ensues every 4 years, roughly 4 or 5 years, or 3 or 4 years actually, as those continue happening, which is inevitable, right? Cycles are inevitable. I believe over time, just based on what we've seen, more people are going to become long-term holders, right? So 155 days or older, your UTXOs have not been moved, you are considered a long-term holder. I believe that after each ensuing cycle, which has been the case to this point, less people begin parting ways with their Bitcoin during bull markets, and that will just be more of an accelerant for Bitcoin's price.
Now we all have to go through our first panic cycle.
Yeah.
It's inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
To learn.
Do you have any evidence, knowledge of institutions like colleges, universities that have endowments going into Bitcoin? It just seems like it would be an obvious choice if you're thinking like 30, 40, 50 years or more, and some of these places have been around for hundreds of years. So putting a little bit of Bitcoin into your endowment would be like just
It's a no-brainer. Yeah, so I believe that there was one institution or one public university, I believe, that began allocating to it in their endowment. I can't remember the name of it, but if you go to bitcointreasuries.net, they have the best running and actively updated catalog of institutions, companies, public and private, and endowments, right, for these universities that are holding Bitcoin. So if you visit bitcointreasuries.net, you could view all those holdings ranked by the amount of Bitcoin that they hold. I think the list is populated with like 147 entities right now, but more are being added constantly, and the existing ones are being updated. So I don't have the live info for that, but if you take a look at bitcointreasuries.net, that'd be the best place to track that.
What do you see as the biggest risk that this world doesn't play out as you think in the next 5, 10, 20 years?
The biggest risk to Bitcoin? Is that, well, the biggest risk I view is something that won't happen. It's that global governments decide to be austere, because that, if we stop printing money all of a sudden, if we stop spending so much at the federal level, then the value prop of Bitcoin becomes less attractive. You can just hold dollars and that'll store your value, into eternity. But that's something that isn't going to happen. And so, I will admit that in my thinking, I've not done as much thinking about, left tail risk, right? Huge risk to Bitcoin. But mine would be the value prop of Bitcoin ceases to exist, or it becomes very, very minimal. And the opportunity cost of holding Bitcoin relative to any other fiat currency is so small that people aren't willing to take it. And that would be if world governments decided to be austere and we abandoned the idea of printing money. That would be the biggest risk to Bitcoin. Because the reason we hold it is because it's absolutely scarce. If world governments all of a sudden decided to stop printing money, stop issuing debt at an accelerating rate, the value prop of Bitcoin would go away. But we can't do that, right? I prefaced my answer by saying it's something that can't happen because we're so reliant on it. The United States in particular is so reliant on it. Our debt to GDP is 125%. The deficit as a percentage of GDP is negative 7.4%. And so our economy is so reliant on this kind of perpetual debt issuance that it's not going to stop anytime soon. It's going to accelerate because the deficit is a percentage of GDP, and the deficit itself has been widening. Our interest payments make that worse. They're now the second biggest line item on the Treasury's balance sheet, second only to our unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. So we really can't stop doing what we're doing. Otherwise, we plunge ourselves into a multi-year, decades-long recession. So because austerity is not an answer, Bitcoin is inevitable. That's where my head is at.
How about the risk individually that we could see from quantum computing and AI?
Right.
Not so much on the Bitcoin network, but individually. For you say my seed phrase, I'm throwing good seed phrase, just that say. Do you think that's a real risk?
Right. So I'm certainly not an encryption expert. I did try to broaden my mind there a little bit, but it felt like I was walking into Astrophysics 101. 2 weeks ago, I went to the OpNext conference, which was here in Boston. It was at the Fidelity Center. And we talked about it last time. We actually raffled off tickets. It was a great event, and there were several panelists. Peter Todd, who in the HBO documentary was revealed as Satoshi, he was there, and he actually had a great discussion on this. So I would look for him on Twitter, maybe fire him a DM about that, because when it comes to quantum computing, AI, the implications of being able to take seed phrases, I'm not the expert on that, but he would be a great resource to look at. And if you go to the OpNext website, it's opnext.dev. All the speakers there had great discussions on this. There were several panelists who were speaking specifically about the implications of quantum computing and AI. So I would take a look at some of those speakers and see if you can get in contact with them about a better answer on that. opnext.dev.
I didn't hear that.
So when you,
That's hard.
Everything else would fall first, so there'd be a flight to the port, and then maybe one in the port. So we don't sort
even if there were a hard fork, it wouldn't matter.
You would get your coin.
You get both. You get both coins, and you go onto the branch that has the quantum resistant.
To your point, if you have an air gap hardware wallet, then there's no internet connectivity for the high compute machine.
So you said, because you didn't hear his answer, right? About the so his answer was that post quantum cryptography has already been, did you say it's already been?
Yeah, I don't know how they do it. Just thinking about it, it seemed like you just kind of all agree to not confirm a transaction unless you both had the private key and something. I don't know how they do it. I'm not an expert.
I think the world would be much crazier place, at that time. Is copying on any least of our worries? You know, is that
All your
Yeah.
passwords will be.
yeah. But I was just wondering if you would consider it to be a risk.
Certainly, right? It's, you know, anything that someone doesn't understand is a risk, right? And that's something I don't understand. And so for now, I view it as a risk factor, right? I'll have to do more research on it. I will. So, the company that I joined in January. So I've been working in markets. Obviously, this whole discussion was about markets, global macro, but more importantly, the value prop of Bitcoin is a company called Theya. So it's spelled T-H-E-Y-A, and this is the flyer that we put together. They're out at the front, so I'd encourage everybody to grab one on their way out. Essentially, it is the world's simplest Bitcoin self-custody solution. So I'm sure all of you have heard of hardware wallets. All of you have heard of, some of you have even heard of Sparrow Wallet, right, which is a software wallet and a multi-sig assembly wallet that you could use on desktop. Basically, the reason we were founded, and we're a brand new company, we just went through our pre-seed, and we're the first Bitcoin-only company to be funded by Y Combinator out in Silicon Valley. And essentially what we are is we are an iOS app, an Android app coming very soon, and a web app that lets you create these multi-sig vaults in a very seamless manner. And so we believe that if Bitcoin is going to become the asset we all think it is, then the lion's share of it needs to be held self-custodially. Currently, only about 1 to, I think, 10 million people globally are actually using a self-custodial Bitcoin wallet in order to store their coins, which is very small. Right, extremely small, especially when you consider that around 1% of the world's population owns crypto, right, most of it being Bitcoin. And so there need to be better solutions in order for people to take custody of their own private keys so they can access their Bitcoin. You can't leave that in the hands of an exchange. And so essentially what we've done at Theya is we have made it extremely easy to set up a self-custody Bitcoin wallet with no technical wherewithal required whatsoever. When our engineers were creating the app, the ethos behind when they were developing was whether or not you'd be able to give it to your grandmother and if she would know what she was doing as she was using it. And so basically what we've done is we've created this app that's extremely sleek, extremely easy to use. It looks and feels like an iPhone app that you've used before. It's very familiar, but it allows you to create these robust Bitcoin multi-sig vaults very easily, like in minutes. I have an iPhone in my car with a Ledger Nano X, and I'll go grab it, you know, as we're all, once I give out the microphone and we stop recording, and I can demonstrate to some of you just how easy it is to set one of these up. But it's extremely revolutionary, right? Because exchanges represent a single point of failure. We all know that, right? You know, you don't want to leave your Bitcoin on an exchange. But by the same token, it's so convenient to do that most people don't even consider self-custody. And obviously the risk of that, the risk of holding your Bitcoin on an exchange only rises as Bitcoin's value rises and as you accumulate more Bitcoin. And so basically what we aim to do at Theya is to bring that 1% of people globally who own Bitcoin and get them to hold it self-custodially, right? That's the whole mission. And we're well on our way to doing that. And what I just mentioned there about us being the first and only Bitcoin-only company to actually go through and be funded by Y Combinator, that's a huge vote of confidence that we're on the trajectory to doing that. For reference, they have never funded another Bitcoin-only company. They've only funded crypto companies. And so the team we've assembled, the app we've assembled, really speaks to that, we are the future of Bitcoin self-custody. And essentially the last kind of thing that I'll say is the way that the app works is that it allows you to create these multi-sig vaults, and basically they're set up in a 2 of 3 fashion. So instead of a single key Bitcoin hardware wallet where there's only one key associated with it, if you lose that key, if you lose your seed phrase or lose that wallet, your Bitcoin's gone forever. Essentially what multi-sig is, for those who might not know, is that there are multiple keys required in order to actually sign away access to your Bitcoin, right? So there are other services that do this. You could also assemble it by yourself by getting these devices and setting it up using an open source software like Sparrow. But it's very difficult, and there are other services that do this as well, but there's nowhere that you can go and then do this by yourself, and certainly there's nowhere you can go and do it by yourself that's as easy as what we've assembled. And so essentially all you do is you go into the iPhone app, you add your first key, which could be any device that you'd like, whether it's a cold card or a passport or any of the major Bitcoin hardware wallets. And then you add your second key. And when you add your second key, you could invite somebody else to come into the vault with you and add their own key. Or you can add a second key, that's your own. And then Theya holds the third key. And we hold that third key for recovery. So if you lose one of yours, you can retain access to your Bitcoin. And the setup time for this, compared to doing it on your own, is orders of magnitude less. So my quickest time in setting up one of these multi-sig vaults is 3 minutes. At the Bitcoin conference, I held a competition. Anybody that could beat me would get 10,000 sats. Nobody beat me. But either way, it's an extremely simple and fast way of eliminating those single points of failure in your Bitcoin security setup, whether you're not on self-custody yet and you're on an exchange, or whether you are in self-custody, but you only have it on one single private key. Theya has made it easier than ever to set up these multi-sig vaults directly from your phone or the web if you'd like to. No technical wherewithal required. And the most important part is it's self-custodial, so you hold all of your private keys, or the person that you invite into the vault with you holds all the private keys as well.